Hello and welcome to Teenagers Untangled, the audio hug for parents going through the teenage years. I'm Rachel Richards, journalist, parenting coach, mother of 2 teenagers and 2 bonus daughters. Now, I recently had a really fascinating chat with Sammy Wright, who wrote the book Examination: Why Our Obsession with Grades Fails Everyone. And while I was preparing for it, I happened to notice another book was published about grades at almost the same time across the pond in the United States. This one's called Failing Our Future: How Grades Harm Students and What We Can Do About It. It's by Joshua Eiler, Director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at the University of Mississippi. Now, given that most of us have kids in school and we know we have an important role to play in their education, I figured, well, we can't talk about this topic enough. So, besides, this entire book has lots of guidance from research that's been done by other people, and as a whole chapter on, hey, what can we parents be doing? So love that. So Josh has kindly joined us today. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Now, what did you know that Examination was coming out, the book that I've just mentioned?
I did not actually. A mutual connection let me know about it, and it's on the way to me now. I'm looking forward to reading it.
It's very different to yours, but it has a similar kind of, thinking behind it. It's much more of a kind of, you can tell it's written by somebody who writes novels as well. And I'll be fascinated to know what you think. But I do think it's interesting how we've got 2 sides of the Western pond actually talking to each other in a sense. So I'd like to start with something that you said in your book that I thought was really sparked something for me. And you talk about how this focus on grades starts really early, and you likened it to Tetris blocks that build up super quickly. And I just thought, gosh, that's such an interesting way of looking at it. And the thing is, grades have been around in our system for a very long time. So what's changed?
Well, I think so much has changed and so much hasn't changed at the same time, and that's part of the problem. And so, I think that Tetris reference says more about my own pop culture touchstones than anything else. But it does start very early, and while we might see it as a grade on this paper or a grade on this exam, the repercussions for the students who are going through this system is akin to the idea of the pile up, that it's not a one and done. It's not, I got a B on this assignment or I got an 82 on this particular test. It's really the cumulative effect on our children's motivation to learn, their performance in the classroom, and their psychology. The grades work kind of in tandem to have this sort of effect on them as learners and as human beings. And that's what we really need to be thinking about. So while the idea of grades and their use in schools has been around for a very long time, the conditions under which our kids are learning right now have shifted pretty dramatically, both with COVID certainly, but in this new for the last decade or more of the role of technology in the classroom, the intensified pressure to get into elite institutions after secondary school. So that has shifted the game in terms of the impact that grades have on students, I think.
And I think I also saw that you mentioned that we now have grade portals, right, so that you have an almost instant ability to look at what the grades are, and for parents to, if they're minded, to put pressure on their kids as a result of whatever they're seeing now.
Yes, I think this is one of the worst inventions that we've seen over the last few years in education. It certainly gives people a lot of information about what's happening, and we always like to emphasize the role of communication between teachers and parents. That's important. But those grading portals operate as some kind of academic version of Big Brother, where everyone can see what is happening with a student at all times. And we would be really deluding ourselves to think that students don't feel that pressure because everyone can see what's happening.
I noted that you said that they can then become strategic learners. So they only focus on the things that they need to get
Yes.
the grade rather than on any form
Right,
of
and that
learning.
is what grades do. That is their fundamental function as extrinsic motivators. That whenever we set up a system where the emphasis is on the prize or the reward, or in this case, grades, students have the incentive to do what they need to do to get the good grade, regardless of the learning that happens along the way. And that is the reality for many of our classrooms. Those are the conditions that they have established. And that's not what we want in education. I certainly don't want it for my daughter or my students, but that is what we have wrought.
Yes, and it's interesting because you also mentioned that grades, they serve as a gatekeeper in a way. You know, you talked about how things have really ratcheted up, and there's so much pressure now to try and get into, you know, elite colleges or just any
Right.
colleges, and there's sort of like a currency. One thing you also talked about was that feedback. Can you talk about the difference between, you know, grades as feedback and whether because they don't really tell you much,
Right.
do they? If you get a grade like my friend used to get a B, and her mother would say, well, why didn't you get an A? And she'd say, well, I don't know.
That's exactly right. So sure, when you see an A in history, what does that really tell you? I mean, a student can say, yes, I got an A in history, but they can't really necessarily talk about what they know and can do in terms of history. So the difference between grades and feedback is simply that feedback is designed to coach learners along the way. So to allow them to progress, to set goals and to meet goals. And feedback is primarily something that we give orally or in writing on assignments. Proponents of grades will argue that grades are a kind of feedback. But because of a grade's role in evaluation and judgment and gatekeeping, as you're saying, students do not receive grades as feedback. They receive grades as doors closing and as judgment on them. And so if we're really interested in learning, we have to put more of an emphasis on giving students feedback along the way. If you think of something, all your listeners out there, think of something that you're really good at and how you became really good at that thing. It is almost always because you tried something out, made a mistake, and someone more knowledgeable gave you feedback, and then you tried again. It is never usually because you got a B- on whatever you were working on. It is almost always because of feedback.
And you said that that often the feedback is used to justify the grade rather than the
Yes,
other
and
way.
that is something that, as a teacher, frustrated me the most about grades. First of all, making the kind of judgment, is this a B plus or an A minus? And then the feedback necessarily having to justify why it was a B plus or an A minus, rather than what I was really interested in, which is helping the students to do better on the next assignment, coaching them through the feedback. So that is.
I mean, you could say that for teachers, it's much easier just to give a grade because that's going to ratchet up the amount of work they have to do. They have to give feedback on every single paper.
That is true. However, most teachers also give feedback in addition to the grade. And the research that we have shows that students, when they receive both a grade and feedback, look only at the grade and disregard the feedback because the spotlight is entirely on the letter or number at the top of the page.
And I suppose when it comes to the teachers, of course, I always say to our listeners, really assume the teacher wants the best for your child. Just go in there thinking they're doing this job because they want these kids to learn. That said, all teachers come with their own biases and prejudices and beliefs about people, and those beliefs will build up. And I know as a student who came from a family who didn't really care about my education, and there was a massive leap between where I started and where I finished as a result of growing. And I was lucky enough I did tests, and it was I had evidence that I had reached a certain standard, whereas some of the teachers would have just gone, yeah, she's that difficult child. and might not have given me the leeway needed. But I don't know to what extent that might happen in classroom
Well, I
settings.
think you nailed it right away, that all teachers are different, and all of them are bringing in their own experiences with education, their training that they received as undergraduates in education, and their experiences in the classroom. And the reality is that we don't talk a lot about the issues that we're talking about right now in teacher training. A lot of it is lesson design, assignment design, making sure people know the appropriate amount of content for the grade level that they're teaching, primary or secondary. And we talk a lot less about the real human dimensions of learning and how to cultivate classrooms full of compassion and empathy, and mindful of each student's growth. And so for me, as someone who studies learning and education, the the idea that learning is a clear-cut kind of process is completely antithetical to what we really know about that process. It is complex, and a student's learning develops at different rates depending on what the course is, etc. Right? And so what we need to do as we help them progress is to create evaluation systems that honor the fact that every individual's process of learning is going to happen at a different rate. And our current system of grades absolutely do not do that. They put a stamp at a particular time on how far someone has advanced, when that student might very well have learned the concepts by the end of the term, rather than at that moment in the term.
Right, and that's those Tetris blocks
Yes,
building up
exactly.
that you just can't. Yeah, yes. And where do you sit in terms of exams? How do you think? Because of course this whole system is leading into an exam situation. What are your thoughts about
I
exams?
think exams can be useful if they are used appropriately. Unfortunately, most of the emphasis on exams is designing them to be very high stakes. So a lot is riding on the particular exam. There are very few of them, and so each carries so much weight with them. And so the best, we have a lot of literature from psychology about the testing effect, in that testing done frequently and with low stakes can help people remember and learn information more effectively. High stakes, major exams do the opposite. They ratchet up the pressure and they lower the bar for learning, in a sense, right? And so I think the idea of testing can be a benefit to learning, but high stakes exams are not.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I've got my daughters are in two different schools, and one gets tested regularly, and the other
Hmm.
one not. And the one who isn't tested regularly complains and says
Yes.
she doesn't get much practice at it, and when it comes around, it feels really stressful, and she wished that she was
Right.
tested more
The other
often.
problem with exams is that teachers often assume that because a student demonstrates that they've learned something on homework or in class, that they're automatically going to do well on the exam. When what we know about doing well on exams is that a student needs practice on the specific kinds of questions they might see on the exam to be able to do a good job on it.
Which is why we have a problem. I mean, in the UK, we have, I don't know what it's like in the US, I think it's slightly different. We have exams at 16, they're high stake
Yes.
exams. You can be doing 11, 12 exams, some do 8, it varies. But yeah, once, a lot of work is put into practicing how to do the
Right.
exams rather than necessarily, am I learning something and enjoying my learning
Exactly. They're
process?
disconnected, which is a big
That
problem.
makes sense. And what about, you're talking about the problem with grades. Have we seen scenarios where it works without grades? Because presumably it's lovely
Right.
talking about things where you say there's a problem here, but how do you, where have we seen that this can
Sure.
work without
So I
grades?
think the major task before us at this moment, because we can't wave a magic wand and get rid of grades, is to reorient a student's experience with grades. And so there are many schools that are and individual teachers as well that are attempting to do this by using different kinds of grading models. So rather than the high stakes traditional grades that we're talking about, there are others who set a variety of standards to meet across the course of the term, and then the grade is determined based on how many standards you meet rather than what did you get on the exam. So that's a pretty simple way to sort of reorient a student's experience. It lowers the pressure, allows them to, it honors the fact that learning happens at different rates for different students. So there are many kinds of experiments internationally with these kinds of grading approaches. There are, on the other hand, there are some institutions, both post-secondary and earlier, that also do not have grades. And so we have several colleges in the United States that are gradeless. The one I feature in the book is Evergreen State College in Washington. They give only narrative feedback, and their transcripts for those students are made up only of selections from that feedback that faculty have given. And those students get into all of the same graduate schools and medical schools that other institutions send their students. So it can happen. It's just that I think making the jump from where we are now to everyone gets rid of grades, it's too much of a gap to bridge. And so we need to take a series of carefully designed steps to help students really change their relationship to grades.
Fascinating. It's interesting because I've mentioned this before. You mentioned Angela Duckworth's
Yes.
study. She's the lady who created talked about grit in the TED Talk. And she said that she decided that she would implement a system in her own, what she was teaching, which wouldn't have grades. And her supervisor said, that's a terrible idea. She said, no, I want to encourage intrinsic learning. And she did it. And she said it was a disaster because the people in the other subjects weren't doing that. So all that happened was all her students they didn't hand in their essays, they didn't turn up to the classes, they just focused on the ones where the grades were pointing. So yes, it kind of, we have to, if we're going to do it, an entire institution needs to do it together. Otherwise, what you do is you just literally, you tip the boat.
Sure, yes.
They're all running to where the grades are.
Right, so because you can't change systems, students will rightly and strategically prioritize where they're getting more pressure. So that is true. I think there are ways to set up guardrails for if you're an individual who wants to try this, there are ways to set up guardrails to kind of acknowledge the reality of that prioritization, but also to help them develop those skills that they need, that they can carry with them from your alternatively graded class into those other courses as well. It's an area of interest for me. How do we help students recognize those skills that they're developing?
You say as an individual, I mean, are we talking about being a parent doing that, or are we talking about being a teacher?
At that moment, I was
doing
talking
that?
about being a teacher, trying out those models. But I think it's also true for parents who cannot change the system, but who can acknowledge the realities and the impact of what grades are doing.
Interesting. So let's talk about what we parents can do. And I noticed that you said that we've gone from a system where early adolescence was kind of an important developmental stage, and then now we kind of treat our children like young adults, simultaneously acting as if they're small children in need of perpetual oversight. I think that's a Madeleine Levin.
It is.
Yes, quote. So what you're doing is grasping the nettle of what's been going on, and you also refer to gardeners and carpenters, and gardeners being the people, the parents who kind of make the conditions good for their plants to grow, whereas the carpenters, I think they're building a child. Can you talk to us about how that relates to the whole thing you're talking about in terms of grades, and how we as parents can support our kids?
Yes, definitely. So the trap that grades set for parents is that we want the very best for our children, and we want them to develop interests and to learn for its own sake, and to develop love for the topics that really for which they have a passion. But we also know that grades are, as you mentioned earlier, a kind of currency that will open or close doors to colleges, to careers, etc., along the way. And so that means that we have this tension where we're both trying to do what's best for students, our children, and also really recognizing those realities. So, but the real danger of that is that we don't know what the future holds for them. We could be that putting pressure on kids to get good grades without knowing what they are actually going to go through in the future only has the effect of undermining our relationship with them. And so a lot of the strategies that I provide in those chapters are really designed to focus less on grades and that imagined future, and really focusing on the kids we have before us, in front of us. How can we communicate to them that our love and our support for them is in no way conditional on the grades that they're getting for in the classroom? How can we help them develop their natural curiosity and love for learning? And so, some of the suggestions I give there, all students are curious. All kids are curious naturally. Every one of us who has kids knows that they ask a lot of different questions about a lot of different things. They have very specific interests in particular things. And to the degree that we can help them build those interests and really encourage those interests, whatever they are at that time, we create, in effect, a kind of suit of armor for them as they leave our houses and go into the classroom. Because if we help them develop interest and curiosity, what that means is they have the building blocks over time to understand that whatever games are happening with grades in the classroom, learning means something more inherently for them, and they can take that with them throughout their lives. So, yeah,
I love that.
that's just
Yes. And so on the one hand, we talk about this stuff all the time on our podcast, the connection, the importance of that
yes.
connection, and also just that curiosity. And practicing that at home and being curious ourselves rather than simply judging or
Right.
there was a quote in your book I loved, which was Jessica Leahy, the author of Gift of Failure, who wrote, "Applying pressure in the form of control is the single most damaging thing parents and teachers can do to their children's learning."
Yes.
And when we say pressure, what do you think would be that type of pressure that would be?
The particular pressure that I'm really focused on in this book is the intense pressure to perform and succeed at all costs in the classroom, that you have to get straight A's or you're never going to get into the right college. So it's the particular pressure that we put on our kids to succeed in the classroom. And again, most kids feel that internally anyway. They know what's going on. They know what's happening with their friends. And so by us doing that, we are only adding to that intense pressure that they are already feeling. And what they need most from us is not adding to their pressure, but being able to release that pressure, to make the home the place where they can come to feel safe, to feel supported, to feel loved, regardless of what is happening academically.
I love that. Oh, I love that. And actually, in addition to that, you said leaders of college career centres are now reporting that employers often care less about the GPA than they do about skills like problem solving and
Yes,
communication.
and I wish that I could send this message in the mail to every parent in the world. That yes, it is true that what we are seeing from our career centers and from other researchers in this area employers care much more about whether you can communicate effectively, whether you can think critically, and whether you can work productively with others than they do about your GPA. And that may not have always been the case, but it is certainly the case now, because what they're recognizing, especially in fields where you really don't know what's coming down the pike 5 or 10 years from now. Like, who could have predicted AI would have been such a major issue right now? What they are banking on is that they are going to be able to teach people who they hire the skills that they need to succeed in the field as those new developments come up, as long as who they are hiring are skilled in these other areas like communication and critical thinking. So GPA has fallen down the list of,
So GPA, for people who may be wondering,
yes,
that's the grade point average.
Yeah.
And I read a book, I forget who it was written by, but it was talking about the age of acceleration. It was called Thank You for Being Late. And he was talking about how in workplaces now, actually what they're looking for is people who can continue to learn, continue to adapt, who have an intrinsic motivation to sort of learn new things, because we're going to have to constantly adapt. It's gone are those careers where you just learn your skills and then you just carry on, you just practice the skills for the rest of your life.
That's absolutely right. And I think what they're recognizing is that our system of grades is really precluding people from coming into professions with that love of learning and the ability to continue learning over the course of their careers.
One thing I wanted to pick out was I'd like to talk about some of the real negative sides of the sort of stress
Sure.
we're talking about, because everybody's talking about a mental health crisis. And looking around me, Jonathan Haidt is talking about social media as one of the core factors. I saw that you picked out Lisa Damour opening one of the chapters in her book, and I think it's called Under Pressure, the book. And the subheading said, "School is supposed to be stressful." And you said, "I fundamentally
Yes.
disagree with that." Can you explain, because there are different types of stress, aren't there? There's eustress and distress. And what do you mean by... Why do you disagree with that?
I sort of disagree with the framing. I know what she's trying to do by saying it's supposed to be stressful, so we need to help people navigate stress. And I don't disagree with that. But what I do disagree with is the school is supposed to be stressful. I don't think that school is supposed to be stressful. I think that it often is stressful, but it doesn't have to be. And if we look at or if we prioritize education and learning rather than sorting, ranking, and certifying, then we get to places, we craft learning environments where school is not stressful, it is joyful, and it is about learning, and it is dynamic and creative and fun and playful. And yes, there is a need to help, especially young people, learn how to manage stress. But that does not mean that we have to create systems that are by their nature stressful. Stress comes no matter what. Let's create schools that prioritize all the other great things about learning and then help students manage that along the way.
I love that, and there's a lot of talk here because we've got a lot of people missing school
Yes.
as well through things like anxiety and not wanting to turn up to school because it feels like a hostile
Right.
environment. And I saw that Pew Research Centre had a survey of children aged 13 to 17, and 96% of those who responded said that anxiety and depression are either a major or minor problem among their
Right.
peers, which is really... And I think that it was saying that the biggest stressor
Yes.
was grades rather
Right.
than how they
Yes, absolutely. So we have a lot of work coming out now showing how grades and academic stress are contributing to this mental health crisis. That particular survey was looking at students' kind of self-reported issues with mental health and then the reasons for it, and grades were at the top of the list. We have other surveys and reports coming out now that really show the increase in percentage from over the last decade of these major mental health challenges that students are wrestling with. And when they're asked to reflect on that, grades comes up in every single report. Now, it's not always the top, but it is near the top in everything that I've seen. And I think that, you know, that is a wake-up call. And if we know that that is happening and we don't have these conversations, if we continue to assume that grades just have to be the way they are because they're at the heart of education, then we really are doing our children a disservice, and we're kind of complicit in that if we refuse to kind of really look at the problem.
Yes, and it's not what you've said is you said the last 10 years, so it's not just
Right.
COVID, because we know that COVID has
Yes.
ramped things up, but that's not where,
It's not.
where it started. One of the other
Sorry, I was just
Go
going
on.
to say it's been going on for a long time. COVID exacerbated it, but it's been happening for a while.
One of the other things that you said parents can do is, so we've talked about connection and, not focusing just on the grades. I think what I loved was one of your points about core assets, focusing on your kids' strengths. And that's one thing we as parents can be very good at if we
Yes.
connect with our kids. So can you talk more about what do you mean by core assets or their
Right,
strengths?
so that comes from a book called Thrivers by Michelle Borba. And what it means is to, rather than focus on all the time on areas that our kids need to continue working on, flipping the script and focusing instead on what are they good at, and how can we number one, let them know that we understand that those are their strengths. Because one of the points she makes in that book is that kids often feel that no one really understands what they are good at. And for parents to recognize that, it really boosts their confidence dramatically. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is once we identify those core strengths and communicate that with our kids, is to help or to provide opportunities for them to build on those strengths. Put them in situations where they can utilize those strengths, or help them engage in activities and after school opportunities where they can cultivate those strengths. And the more you communicate from this strength-based framework to children, and to really help them develop them, the more they are better able to go into stressful classroom environments where grades loom large, and to say, this is who I am. I have these strengths. Let me draw on these strengths to do the best I can. And if the best I can is less than an A, I still know who I am and what I'm good at.
I'm a
Yes,
person of value.
exactly,
Yes.
because I've been building, these strengths have been highlighted for me.
Yes, and you also talk about advocating in schools. So I have had an entire episode where we talked about how when they go to secondary school, it's very tempting to kind of pull back a bit, because they don't, often you just drop them at the gate and then you go in when there's a parents' evening, which is very infrequent, and pretty much they get on with it, and you can provide them with homework setups and things, or check their grades. But there's this talking to the
Yes.
teachers, communicating with school, advocating. So I think you also mentioned campaigning against grade portals and talking to teachers about the grading system. How can parents have either listened to this podcast or they've actually decided to buy your book? What are the things they can be doing with schools to flag up to schools, look, we're on this, we're interested in this, and we'd like a change in the temperature?
So one thing that you said just a few minutes ago, I think, is the place to start. And so a key is both teachers and parents approaching this assuming best intentions, so that parents are assuming it of teachers and teachers assuming it of parents as well, so that we are allies working together for the good of our children's education. So beyond that, I think in terms of grades specifically, really asking questions about the particular grading models at the school, of the way grades are given, and in a genuinely curious way. We just want to know about how your philosophy about grades and how you give grades in your classes. So just really kind of starting the ball rolling there. But I do think that there is a place for research-informed advocacy about major issues like grading portals or like the way class rank is determined, things like that, where the messaging of the schools is part of the problem. And so coming together, utilizing some of the research either in this episode or in other things that they might read to approach a particular problem. So identify the problem rather than the emotion behind it, right? My child is suffering. I need to talk to you, and I'm approaching it like a parent who is upset. So rather than that, even though that may be true, identifying the clear-cut specific problem and bringing information to that advocacy. I think that that is a way to open the door so that the teachers and the administrators don't feel like they're back on their heels in the defensive position, but they can respond in an academic, intellectual way about the particular issue, and then the conversation can move forward from there. I think that, in combination with organizing, that a kind of community organizing framework for parents around particular academic issues, is also a very useful approach for this. I think so. A lot of parents assume that they have no power whatsoever in these conversations about academics. About other things like school dances and things like, about fundraising, things like that, I think parents feel like they have some agency. But it's very often the case that parents feel like they do not have agency about academic issues. And so identifying people within the community of parents who might be able to use social capital or organizing principles to bring groups together about those issues is equally as beneficial in terms of organizing and advocating as for any other type of issue that might come up in schools. It's just not done very often, so schools don't recognize that kind of organizing as often happening, but it can be very effective.
And just finally, what would you say to somebody who, I came under huge pressure for myself to get good grades for my A levels because I wanted to go to university. Once I worked out what university was, I came under huge pressure at the end of my university degree to get really, because it was all 9 exams, 100%. I had to work so hard, but I learned a huge amount in that process. That kind of, it's like, striking iron. What would you say to someone who said, yes, but you can't achieve great things, you can't make those massive leaps if you don't put them under this huge pressure? We don't have these grades, we don't have this fear that you're going to not do very well, because why would they do their work?
So there's a lot there. One is the grades as motivating a factor, right? And again, grades can be useful for things that require compliance. So getting people to turn things in on time or getting them to attend class, grades work for that. But a grade will never be able to create conditions where someone will learn just because they are forced to be in the classroom. That takes intrinsic motivation. And so that's something that we really have to be cautious of. But so the first part of this, will they go on to do great things? I really think that part of our job as a parent is to help redefine what great things means. So what we want is for our children to find the best future for them, not some kind of nebulous, predetermined model of success that might be out there. And the best careers for our individual kids may not, in fact, often does not require going to the most elite institutions or getting perfect scores on exams. You can often it is often the case that elite institutions do not always provide the same level of support and mentoring that other institutions do. And so you can be a great engineer, cook, teacher, all these things without going to the most elite institutions. So if we dial back from the cookie cutter and say, what does my child want and what would make them most fulfilled, and focus on that, we can find the right institutions for that match. And it does not require perfect grades. Good grades, sure, but not perfect grades. And I think that's a really important distinction.
Yeah, I love that. And I think our obsession with academia, where so many people just don't suit it. And I've had this battle with one of my children where she has the option of doing, it's the same name for the course, but they're different. One's much more practical, one's much more theoretical. And she's feeling pushed in the theoretical direction, even though she's really fantastic at the practical side of it, because she wants to go to a prestigious university. And you just go, oh, this is such a waste of humanity, our human resources, when they feel funneled in one direction just to suit some social idea of what a successful
That's exactly
person is.
right. So the goal can't be just to go to the prestigious institution because it's the prestigious institution, right? The goal has to be finding a place that's the right fit for what you want to do. And I think that is really the moral of the story.
That's a brilliant way to end. Joshua, thank you so much for being with us today. It's such a vital topic, and I know our entire community feels really strongly about it. I'll put your details in the link for the book. If people want to find you online, where would they come?
I'm on all social media platforms, LinkedIn or X, formerly Twitter, all of it. They can even send an email to me. This is an important conversation. I'm grateful to you, Rachel, for having me on.
Well, that's it for now. If you found this interesting, why not pass it on to someone else who might benefit? You can hear any of my other interviews and episodes at www.teenagersuntangled.com. Feel free to email me at teenagersuntangled@gmail.com, and you can even leave a review. That's it for now. Have a great week. Bye-bye.